Now, those who know where I live, it's in Middle Tennessee, and there is a rather famous ghost legend here that it's surprising I haven't told this story on here before, but
Mhm.
it's the legend of the Bell Witch.
Mm.
And it ties up into American history, like even with a few of America's historical figures, allegedly, of course. I have not verified any of these. They're all it's all this stuff that's passed down and through oral tradition and so forth. But I've got a condensed version of this story that we'll go ahead and tell. Um, and I've got this all written down here. So if your
Mm.
paper's fluttering, anybody listening, that's what you're hearing. So, okay, the story begins sometime around 1817. There's a farmer named John Bell who lived with his wife Lucy and six children: Jesse, Betsy, Richard, John Jr., Drew, and Benjamin in northwest Robertson County, Tennessee, which is just down the road from where I live. It's like roughly half an hour from my house.
Mm.
Uh, John actually moved his family from North Carolina to the Red River community, which is now Adams. He bought some land and a large house, and over the next few years, he kept buying land until he increased his holdings to a whopping 328 acres. I currently live on half an acre.
Oh.
Meanwhile, he became an elder at the Red River Baptist Church, and his family, they had a very happy and successful early life in this region. Things went really well for them, and they were considered prosperous. Things take a very slow turn. One day, John's out in his cornfield and he spots what's been described as a weird looking animal in the middle of a corn row. It had the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. He actually shot at it several times, but the animal just vanished. Um, then later in the night, supposedly the family heard sounds like either within the house or outside of just something beating against the walls outside the house. And things actually then they escalate from there as days go on. As time went on, they started hearing whispers. They were too faint to understand, but it said that they sounded like a feeble old woman singing church hymns. Then Betsy, the youngest daughter, she started having brutal encounters, like horrifying encounters with some kind of an invisible entity. Supposedly, it would pull her hair and slap her in the face hard enough to leave welts and handprints. At first, John vowed all of this was going to just be a family secret. He didn't want to bring anybody into whatever their problems were. But when things got bad enough, he started sharing their troubles with his closest friend and neighbor, a guy named James Johnston, who was another uh, public figure held in really high esteem, not just by him, but also by the community. Well, from there, and this is where this starts connecting a little bit with American history. John Jr., Drew, and Jesse, three of his sons, they all actually fought under General Andrew Jackson. And that is, of course, the President Andrew Jackson, who would later serve in office. But they fought for him in the Battle of New Orleans. Then in 1919, this was just 10 years before Jackson would become president, Jackson heard supposedly about these disturbances and decided to pay the family a visit. Old Rough and Ready, naturally, of course he would, right? He traveled with a pretty big entourage. This fits several men, several horses, and a large wagon. But as they approached the home, the wagon, it says that it jolted and it stopped without warning. It got stuck in some kind of a muddy creek bed, and the horses just they could not pull it out. At least that's what the men thought. There were supposedly several minutes of cursing, gnashing of teeth as they tried coaxing the horses, and supposedly Jackson finally said, "By the eternal, boys, that must be the Bell Witch." So
Mm.
right after he says this, a disembodied female voice answered, and she told them that they could proceed, and she would see them later in the evening. So afterward, they were free to free the wagon, and they got to the Bells' home. That night, Jackson told war stories, as war heroes will do, while the entourage, they all set up tents out on the property, out on the farm. The first few hours were uneventful. I'm sure there was drinking and partying and just general merriment. But then one of the men who actually remained in the house with Jackson and the family, he claimed to be what they called a witch tamer. I'd never heard of that until I started researching this. But he showed off his pistol and he said that it had a silver bullet that would kill any evil spirit it came in contact with. And he told the family the reason nothing had happened yet was because whatever had been haunting the home was afraid of that bullet. And then, right after he said this, he started screaming and jerking his body in all different directions. He told them that he was being stuck with pins and beaten. And supposedly, an invisible kick to his butt sent him right out the front door. And so then the disembodied voice speaks again, and now it's outright angry. And it says there was a fraud in Jackson's party, and she would identify this fraud before the night was over. Jackson's men, after this, begged to leave the farm, but Jackson, being Jackson, insisted on staying. He wanted to know who this other fraud was. They kept begging, but eventually they all went to sleep in their tents. Now, at this point in this particular story, things get murky. It's not really clear. The one thing that's known for sure is the next morning, and I say for sure, supposedly for sure, the next morning, Jackson and his men were spotted in a nearby town called Springfield as they were headed toward Nashville. And some say Jackson later told people, I would rather fight the British at New Orleans than fight the Bell Witch. Well,
Mm.
despite all of this continues, and there's so much I'm leaving out. But despite all of this, life carries on for the family, and Betsy actually becomes interested in a young man named Joshua Gardner. And they had both of their parents' blessings, and they decided to get married. And everybody was really happy about this, except, of course, this entity. Uh, at this point, the entity now has identified itself as Old Kate Bat's witch, or just Kate. And Kate was furious. She ordered Betsy over and over not to marry Joshua. They couldn't go to the river, they couldn't go to the fields or the nearby cave without Kate nagging them. And the constant pressure just became more than Betsy could handle, and so she broke off the engagement. So then disturbances decreased for a little while after that ended, but Kate still, one of the things that was a constant, Kate absolutely hated John Bell, and she was constantly harassing him to the point of finally saying that she vowed to kill him. She was going to kill this guy before it was all said and done. Now, John Bell, the father, was already experiencing episodes of twitching in his face, and he had trouble swallowing for almost a year. And supposedly, this is where the term for Bell's palsy actually came from, even though
Hmm.
people are people are pretty sure he didn't have it. It's been falsely attributed to him, supposedly. So then naturally, it just progressively got worse until by the fall of 1820, his health was so poor that he was confined to the house. He couldn't get out and do anything anymore. So while he was confined to the house, Kate just tormented him. She would remove his shoes anytime he tried to walk, which is just petty and mean. And then, like with Betsy, she would actually slap his face anytime he recovered from some of the seizures that he would have. And it really gets grim from here. The voice now was described as shrill and cold, and it could be heard all over the farm cursing John and calling him Old Jack Bell. On December 19th, 1820, John Bell slipped into a coma and then died the following morning. Afterward, the family found this vial of strange black liquid in one of the cupboards. John Jr. sprinkled 2 drops on one of their pet cat's tongue, and the cat jumped in the air, flipped, and was dead when it hit the floor. Kate then spoke up and said, I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, which fixed him. And so he's like the only historical figure credited with being killed by a ghost,
Mhm.
supposedly.
Mhm.
So after this, John Jr. tossed the vial into the fireplace and it burst into a bright blue flame. John's funeral was one of the largest ever held in Robertson County. People came from miles away, and 3 preachers, 2 Methodists and 1 Baptist, gave the eulogy. As the mourners left the graveyard, though, they said that they could hear Kate laugh and sing a song about a bottle of brandy, which again, just so petty and cruel. Uh,
Mhm.
And she did not stop until the last mourner was gone. And then, for a while, she disappeared. A year or so later, actually less than a year, about 6 months really, Kate returned in April of 1821. She returned and visited John's widow, Lucy, and she told her she was leaving, but she would return in 7 years. And apparently she did. As promised, she came back in 1828 and focused her attention on John Jr. Supposedly, she and John had lengthy conversations about the origin of life, civilizations, Christianity, and the need for a major spiritual reawakening. Supposedly, she also predicted the Civil War and other major events that were going to happen in the future. Um, she was apparently hit or miss on some of these. But the Civil War, if she predicted that, supposedly she got that one right. But then, after 3 weeks of these visits, Kate said she was leaving again, but promised to visit John Bell's most direct descendant in 107 years. That would be 1935. And at that point, there was a Nashville physician named Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, who was a neurologist and John Bell Sr.'s great grandson. And this is where things start wrapping up. A year before that, 1934, Dr. Bell actually published a book about the Bell Witch to raise awareness of the spirit's impending return. It had the first ever account at the time of those supposed meetings between John Jr. and Kate. And Dr. Bell's father, Dr. Joel Thomas Bell, allegedly took notes during those meetings. And when he died, he passed those notes on to his son. Uh, Dr. Bell didn't publish any follow up to that book, and he died in 1945, and he's buried in Bellwood Cemetery in Adams, Tennessee. So the question is, did Kate, aka the Bell Witch, did she return in 1935 as promised? Some say she didn't, or that if she did, they weren't aware of it. Others say she never left. So she's still there today.